We gave a brief introduction last time that we were together by saying that Joshua begins a new section in the Bible. The first 5 books of the Bible is what we call the Pentateuch. It's called the Torah, the Law of Moses. It's the foundational books of Israel. It talks about their beginnings as a nation. And then picking up in Joshua begins a section called the historical books. Because it deals with more of the history of the nation of Israel as it progresses onward up toward the Babylonian captivity. And even though it's a new section of the Bible, it continues the same story. In fact, it picks up exactly where Deuteronomy left off. So we're following the same narrative. So looking at this book of Joshua as an overview and as a whole, we've listed here the purpose of the book of Joshua. And we said going through all of these books that we've gone through, we always keep an eye on the covenant. Because everything that we've read in Genesis, the last half of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, even into Joshua, is all about the covenant. The covenant that God made with Abraham, all the way back in Genesis 12, where God says, I'm going to take you, Abram, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. I'm going to bless you. Through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And then I'm going to take this nation that I'm going to make out of you, and I'm going to bring them into a land. And this is a land of promise. It's a land of inheritance. And I'm going to settle you in this land. So everything we've been working toward is about the covenant and about this land promise that God would establish His people in His land, a place where He would put His name and bless His people as they lived life in covenant with Him. So that's what we're talking about. So we come to the end of Joshua, and we find here in Joshua chapter 21, we find these words that are written here near the end of Joshua. And so the purpose of Joshua is summarized in these words. So when you look in Joshua 21, 43 and 45, it says this: Thus the Lord gave Israel all the land that He swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as He had sworn to their fathers. Not one of their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hand. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. So that's the full 2 verses there in 3 verses in 43 through 45. And that's the crux of the matter of why we have Joshua. It's to show that God, Yahweh, Israel's God, had in fact been faithful to His promises. And He said time and time again, despite their failures, despite their shortcomings, despite all the times that it seemed like they had to start over again or wander in a wilderness, even with the death of the whole first generation and the birth of a new generation, even with the exit of Moses off the scene and coming into Joshua, God is still faithful to His promises. And the book of Joshua shows that. So it shows that what has been anticipating all this time of this nation going into this land to settle there had in fact taken place. So that's kind of our purpose here in the book of Joshua, to show that God has been faithful to the covenant. When we talk about what happens in the book of Joshua, well, there's a lot that happens in the book of Joshua. Some of the contents of Joshua, the first 5 chapters today, we'll look at them crossing over the Jordan River into the land, and how God brings them into the land and prepares them for conquest. Because here's the kicker. God says, I'm going to give you a land, but this land is full of people that's already living there. They're called the Canaanites. Canaanites were a wicked group of people that worshiped false gods, that practiced child sacrifice, that were horrible people. So you have these people already in the land, but yet God says, I'm going to give you this land. And how will they do that? Well, you do it the old-fashioned way. You go to battle, and you have war, and you fight. That's what the Canaanites did to themselves. They would battle themselves for territories. This is the ancient world that we are living in. here in the book of Joshua. So you take the land by conquest. So what's going to happen is we're going to see God giving his people victory over the inhabitants of the land. And remember, we're kind of talking about this holy war as well. When the children of Israel were in Egypt and God freed his people from the hand of Pharaoh, it was also God, Yahweh, showing his power over the gods of Egypt. You remember when we looked at the plagues of Egypt, and every plague kind of corresponded with an Egyptian god, and it was showing how Yahweh's power was greater. Well, it's going to be the same thing here with the Canaanites. Because Yahweh gives his people victory over the Canaanites, it's showing that Yahweh has victory over the Canaanite gods. The major Canaanite god especially was Baal or Baal. And we're going to see Baal and Baal followers and Elijah and the prophets of Baal do battle. And so this is going to be a constant theme as well. So when you look at the earthly battles, just know that there's also this holy heavenly battle as well in the minds between all of these nations, between Yahweh and Baal and these other nations with their gods as well, showing God's supremacy over all spiritual power. So God gives them victory over the inhabitants of the land. That takes place in chapter 6 through 12. God distributes the land for the settlement of the people. So that's another major section that we have, where the land is divided, because this land is referred to as an inheritance. So the land is divided and each tribe gets their inheritance. Joshua concludes with a renewal of the covenant in chapters 23 and 24, whereby the people publicly and formally acknowledge that God has fulfilled his promises and they are indebted to him, obliged by covenant to be faithful. So that's some of the sort of the scenes that we will look through as we make our way through the book of Joshua. The important thing about the book of Joshua and what the book of Joshua wants to convey is that Joshua is a second Moses, and that he's to be revered in the sight of the people. He's to be honored and respected as their leader, and just as the people honored Moses, they are to honor Joshua. And this happens in several ways. It happens through incidences that happened in Moses' life that are comparable to what happens in Joshua. We're going to look at some of those in just a moment. It also happens because of God exalting Joshua, God's stamp of approval, if you will, on Joshua. We see several instances. The crossing of the Jordan River is God's stamp of approval on Joshua. So one of the purposes here in Joshua is to show that as a leader, Joshua is to be honored, listened to, and respected just like Moses was. Just kind of going back on Joshua's life, Joshua first appears back in Exodus 17 as a leader of Israel's army in some of their early stages of preparation for what's getting ready to happen now, where he led Israel's army over the victory of the Amalekites. We also find Joshua at the foot of Mount Sinai as Moses received the law. He was near the tent of meeting when Moses met with God face to face. So, of course, he's Moses' assistant, one of his right-hand men. So God, through Moses, was even preparing Joshua for his task way back in the book of Exodus. Then, of course, Joshua is also most familiar as being one of the 12 spies that went to spy out the land of Canaan in the book of Numbers. And of course, we talked about that at length. There were 12 spies that went into the land to spy out the land. 10 spies came back with a negative report. There's people in the land. They're bigger than us. They're stronger than us. The cities are walled. We are like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so they come back to sway the people to give up, to stop, to say we can't enter the land. But then there were two men, Joshua being one, Caleb being the other, that came back and said, we are well able to take this land. God has promised this land to us, and let's go up at once and take this land. One of those men were Joshua. And because Israel listened to the voice of the 10, and the 10 spies came back. That generation died out, except we see Joshua and Caleb continuing. After bringing the people to the edge of the Jordan, Moses dies. Joshua then leads the people into the promised land. So the book of Joshua opens up with some important statements. The book of Joshua opens with God's assurance that although Moses has died, he will help Joshua, Moses' successor, to conquer the land as the Lord promised. So let's read together in Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. It's right here on your paper if you just want to look at it. It says, "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, 'My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving them to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I am giving to you, as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you.'" So this is God's word of assurance to Joshua. The first word of assurance is, even though Moses is dead, the mission doesn't stop. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, proceed to go forth over. The promise did not die with Moses. The promise did not die with the previous generation. So the first word of assurance is, Moses, my servant, is dead, but now go forth and proceed to cross the Jordan. The word of assurance is, I've still promised this land to Israel, and I'm still going to give it to them. Cross into the land that I am giving them. The assurance that I'm still fulfilling my promises. The assurance that God will bless Joshua as a leader. Every place the sole of your foot will tread upon, I am giving to you as I promised to Moses. And then he lists all the territory. The promise and the assurance of victory is given here in these first 5 verses. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. His success as a leader. And then he promises, and the greatest assurance is that God was going to be with him. Is the assurance of God's presence. As I was with Moses, so will I be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. So we start out with assurance. Now that hopefully that made Joshua feel good. And then after this assurance, we're going to see that there were some responsibilities that Joshua had to keep himself. But we will look at those in just a few moments. So as Joshua, same promise, same God, same presence that would be with him, same victory that is promised. Joshua showing the second Moses. Some of the similarities between Joshua and Moses, like Moses, Joshua sends out spies to scout out the land. In chapter 2, instead of 12, Joshua sends out 2 spies. Like Moses, he led the people on a miraculous crossing, causing the waters of the Jordan River to stand still while all Israel crossed over on dry land. Of course, one of the most famous scenes with Moses is the parting of the Red Sea. And while, obviously that in our minds and, as we read in the scripture and as we've watched in movies, that's a dramatic picture of all the waters, piling up. This one, is a dramatic scene as well. Usually it's not pictured in our minds as huge as the Red Sea, but it is a miraculous where God stops the flowing waters, makes them stand up, and Israel crosses on dry land. So we see the same thing happened here at the Jordan River as we did at the Red Sea. Just as Moses encountered God at a burning bush and giving Moses a call, Joshua encounters in chapter 5 what is called the captain of the Lord's army. So he has a unique encounter as well, which we'll talk about it in a little bit when we get there. But Most people see that as a Christophany. This is actually Christ, pre-incarnate Christ that appears to Joshua here. He encounters the captain of the Lord's army, who said to Joshua exactly what God said to Moses at the burning bush. Take your shoes from off your feet, for the place that you are standing on is holy ground. So the captain of the Lord's army appears to Joshua, says the same thing to Joshua that God said out of the burning bush to Moses. And also, like Moses, Joshua was able, in God's sovereignty, to work miracles. In a battle against the Amorites, he prays for more daylight and the sun stands still. We don't see the number of these miraculous things like we did, especially with Moses in Egypt, but we do see miraculous things happening by God on behalf of Joshua. So Joshua is this new Moses, the second Moses that is going to lead his people into the Jordan or cross the Jordan into the Promised Land. And as we said, leading people across the Jordan to the Promised Land to take the land is done by conquest. Is done by battle and by fighting. After crossing the Jordan River, they enter the land now inhabited by a number of people groups, most notably the Canaanites, the Amorites. The term conquest refers to a series of wars fought by the Israelites to secure control over the land that had been inhabited by their ancestors, the patriarchs. So when we read the book of Joshua, we see there's three major military campaigns. The first one that we see we're going to start looking at next week, and that is probably the one we're most familiar with, and that is at Jericho and Ai. Of course, we all know about the walls of Jericho, marching around Jericho. That's probably the most famous battle that we find here. That's not the only one. There are three major campaigns. The central campaign is 6 through 8, and that takes place. You see our handy-dandy little map that we have down there. In the middle is the central campaign as they cross over to Jericho and Ai. Then the second one is the southern campaign, which is primarily around Jerusalem and that area. That takes up chapters 9 and 10. The northern campaign is way up in the north up there. That takes up in chapter 11. So the central campaign includes conquering the cities of Jericho, Ai, and Bethel. And that takes place when Israel's camped at Gilgal. When neighboring city in the central region, Gibeon, submits to Joshua and signs a treaty with Israel, a coalition is formed by several southern city-states to put a stop to the growing threat, represented by the Israelites. Jerusalem, inhabited by the Jebusites, took the lead in this coalition. The third campaign was against another coalition, this time in the north, under the leadership of the city of Hazor. So we're going to see there's a lot of military strategy, and of course, as we saw, some places just surrendered, others had to be taken by force, and that's all a part of the conquest that we find there. So we'll look at those in the chapter 6 through 11 of Joshua. Now let's get into going through the first 5 chapters of the book of Joshua. We saw here that Joshua picks up where Deuteronomy left off with the death of Moses. We looked at the first 5 verses of Joshua that shows God's assurance to Joshua. Now let's continue to look and continue our journey through these first 5 chapters of the book of Joshua. The Lord's charge to Joshua, we see that in the first 9 verses of chapter 1. God appears to Joshua after Moses' death, and the Lord challenges his new leader 3 times to be strong and courageous. So after these assurances in the first 5 verses, we find now God is challenging Joshua. God's going to do his part. God's going to provide for Joshua. He's going to make a great leader out of Joshua. He's going to give Joshua victory, but there are some things Joshua needs to do. All right, let's look at some of those. So if you have your scripture, let's start in verse number 6. Verse number 6, verse number 7, and verse number 9, God tells Joshua to be strong and courageous. To be strong and very courageous. For even though God has promised him victory, even though God says, I will be with you, Joshua still has to walk this out. He still has to lead the people. He still has to organize the people. He still has to command the people. He still has to go into battle with these nations. This is not an easy task that's going to happen. So 3 times here in verse number 6, God says to Joshua, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them." So new leader, but same promise. But the call is to be strong and courageous. Verse number 7, "Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success." So, same or new leader, same law. Even though the law does not take, obviously the content of Joshua that we saw in Numbers, in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it is still at the forefront. Just as there's the promise of the land, there's the importance of keeping the law. And as a leader, it was important for Joshua to keep the law, to meditate on it day and night, to be careful to do what it says, to not turn to the right or the left from the law, for still keeping the law still brings blessing and curses. So God has promised Joshua, "I will be with you, I'll give you the land, I'll make you a great leader." But Joshua, you got to be strong and courageous. You still need to be careful to observe the law. So new leader, same promise. New leader, same law. The third strong and courageous is in verse number 9. God says again, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened. Do not be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." So new leader, but same presence of God. So 3 times God tells Joshua, be strong and courageous on the basis of we have a same promise of giving the land, the same law, and the same presence that I will be with you. And these are also bookended by God's assurance of presence with them. Verse number 5 again ended with, "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you." Verse number 9 ends, "The Lord your God is with you wherever you go." So Joshua can take assurance in knowing that God's presence is there. But still his charge is be strong and courageous, to obey the voice of God, to obey and keep the law. So that's what we find here in these first 9 verses, which echoes back again to Moses as well. Verses 4 and 5 echo Deuteronomy 7:24 and 11:24. 1:6 echoes Deuteronomy 31:23. So again, there are all these references and echoes back to Moses' time, connecting these two together. As we move into chapter 1, verses 10 through 18, 10 through 18 already shows Joshua adopting a Moses-like role. He receives commands from God and issues commands to the people. Remember, that's what Moses did. Moses acted as a mediator. God would speak to Moses. Moses would speak to the people. God would command Moses. Moses would command the people. We find the same thing going on here. Again, showing that Joshua is a same leader like Moses was. He issues commands to the people, telling them to prepare to cross the Jordan in 3 days. Joshua then approached the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. If you don't remember, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh were 3 tribes that wanted to settle on the east side of the Jordan. They were happy there. They liked the land there. It was good for them and their families. So they asked Moses, "Can we stay on the east side of the Jordan and not enter the promised land?" And Moses said, "You can on one condition, is that when the other tribes go into the land to take the land, you go and fight with them. And you fight with them and stay with them until they've gained victory. And only after they've gained victory can you go back to your land and settle there. So what happens here is Joshua approaches these tribes, as they had permission to live on the east side, and he reminds them, this is what you said. And they pledge their support to Joshua here. In fact, what they say is, it's, again, very assuring to show that Joshua is a type of leader. In verse number 16 of chapter 1, this is the response of these three tribes. Joshua 1:16. As they answered Joshua, all that you have commanded us, we will do. Again, pledging their obedience and support to their leader. And wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your commandment and disobeys your words, whatever you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. So these three tribes pledge their support to their new leader, Joshua. As we go into chapter 2, we find one of the more interesting stories in the book of Joshua. And this is Joshua is sending out spies into the land. And he sends 2 spies out into the land, as we find here in the first verse of chapter 2 of Joshua. Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So he's scouting out the first place that they have to take conquest. And so these 2 men go into the land of Jericho to spy out the land. And of all places where they go to find refuge, they go to the house of a prostitute. We don't know why they go to the house of a prostitute. It could be maybe it's not unusual to see a bunch of men coming in and out of that house, and maybe they wouldn't be seen as much as they would just wandering around the other parts of the city. But they end up in the house of a prostitute named Rahab. And Rahab certainly gives us a surprise response here to these spies to show that Rahab and her family recognize who the nation of Israel is. So Joshua sends out these 2 spies into the land of Jericho. The spies enter the home of Rahab, who was a prostitute. The king of Jericho then hears word that Israelite men had come into Jericho and they were at Rahab's home. So they send officers to Rahab's house to arrest them, but something happens. Rahab hides the spies and tells the soldiers that the men had already left. So let's read a little bit here in Joshua chapter 2, verse number 2. Joshua chapter 2, verse number 2. As it was told the king of Jericho, "Behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land." They bring the king of Jericho. Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out the land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, "True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them in the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords. The gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. So one of the fun things you talk about, especially in biblical ethics class, is the fact that Rahab concocts a plan and lies to the officers and the king. And, obviously, one of the commandments was you shall not lie. So the question is, is it okay to lie from time to time? Well, if you're a parent, we all know that answer is yes. But this is an interesting thing, because she was not going to give over these men, and we'll see why she didn't give over these men in just a moment, but she hides them, and she concocts this lie. She doesn't say, I don't know what you're talking about. She says, no, they were here, but then when they were getting ready to close the gate, they didn't want to be locked into the city, so they went ahead and left, and they're not here anymore. So she tells this lie. So that, that goes into the discussion, or sometimes, is there a righteous lie? If you're lying for righteousness' sake, if you're lying to protect something good, is that always a bad thing? Obviously, in this case, it is not a bad thing. So interesting discussion that could be had there, but that's what Rahab does. And here's why she does this. Let's continue. She does this because she recognizes something about the children of Israel, the things they had heard about the children of Israel, the things they had heard about their God Yahweh. So here's what she says in verse number 8. Before the men lay down, she came to them on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you the land. Wow, okay. Okay, you wouldn't assume, a Canaanite woman living in Jericho would make a statement like this. But in fact, we see all throughout Scripture that God uses the most unlikely people to push His will forward. He does that with Ruth in the book of Ruth. He does that through Esther in the book of Esther. He does that here through Rahab. So this woman living in Jericho who is a prostitute has this knowledge that I know that the Lord has given you the land, and the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. So she's aware of the people of Israel. Obviously, there's been word because of the previous battles that had been won, and the people rising up on this side of the Jordan. Certainly the fame of what happened in Exodus with Egypt has spread abroad. So even Rahab here recognizes that God has given the people the land, the people of Israel the land. It says, we heard how you dried up the water of the Red Sea when you came out of Egypt. We heard what you did to the kings of the Amorites. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. There was no spirit left in us. For the Lord, your God, He is God in the heavens above and the earth beneath. What a statement she makes. What a statement she makes. She says, for Yahweh, your God, He is Yahweh in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. What an amazing statement that she makes there, expressing her belief in their God. Now, because she knows who their God is, because she knows what their God is capable of, and because that she has supported these men by hiding them in her house, by sending away the officials that they do not get arrested, she makes a covenant with them for protection, because she knows that they're getting ready to conquer Jericho. So she says in verse 12, please swear to me by the Lord that I have dealt kindly with you, and you also will deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, brothers and sisters, and all that belong to them. Deliver our lives from death. And the men said to her, our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. Then it says, she let them down by rope through the window, for her house was built into the city wall. So she lived in the wall. She said to them, and this she's giving them instructions on when they're leaving. Go to the hills, or the pursuers will encounter you. Hide there 3 days until your pursuers have returned, then afterwards go your way. The men said to her, we will be guiltless with respect to this oath of yours, as you have made us swear. Behold, when we come into the land, you shall tie this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down. And you shall gather into your house your father, your mother, your brothers, your father's household. And if anyone goes out of the doors of the house into the street, his blood will be upon his own head. We shall be guiltless. But if a hand is laid on anyone who is with you in the house, the blood shall be on our head. If you tell this business of ours, we shall be guiltless with respect to your oath. And she said, according to your words, so be it. Then she sent them away. They departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. So the pictures here are abundant, especially in regards to the Passover. She makes this covenant. I want you, because I've been kind to you, I want you in return because I've been kind to you. I'm honoring your God. I recognize your God. I recognize the victory He's given you. Spare me and my family. So they said, we will do that. If you don't tell our business, if you don't rat us out, we will spare your family. He says, so here's what you do. You take a scarlet cord, a red scarlet cord. You put it on the window that we've escaped from tonight. When we come in, take all your family, gather them in the house, and when we see the scarlet cord, your family will live. And this is an obvious reference to the Passover. When God says, I'm sending the death angel through Egypt, gather your families in the house, take the blood of a lamb, put it over the doorpost, over the top of the door, down the doorpost, and then when the death angel goes through the land, when they see the red, when they see the blood on the door, they will pass over and the people in your house will live. So this is an obvious picture to that. So that's the story of Rahab. In chapters 3 through 4, we have the crossing of the Jordan River itself. So after the spies go into the land, the two spies go into the land, they're treated kindly by Rahab. They do exactly what she says. They return back to Joshua and to the people. And this time, these two, and I don't think it's any coincidence that Joshua only sent 2 spies out, because how many came back in Numbers with a good report? 2. Well, these 2 come back, and guess what? They come back with a good report. They say to Joshua what Rahab said to them. At the end of chapter 2, truly the Lord has given all this land into our hands, and the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. So they come back with a good report, with this word of faith that, yes, the Lord's given us this land. That's what Rahab told them. And the inhabitants melt away because of us. That's what Rahab told them. So they come back knowing that victory is theirs. So now what they have to do is actually go into the land, because they're still on the banks of the Jordan River, on the east side of the Jordan. So now they have to go into the land. And that takes up chapters 3 and 4. There are 5 main strands of topics to look out for in chapters 3 and 4. First of all, it's the people of Israel themselves and how all of the people will cross over the Jordan into the Promised Land. Another part of this in chapters 3 and 4 is the importance of the Ark of the Covenant. Even though it's a similar scene as crossing a body of waters, the Red Sea, the key to this crossing is going to be the Ark of the Covenant. So Joshua is going to have the priest take the Ark of the Covenant, and the priest will enter into the water with the Ark of the Covenant, and God is going to stop the flow of the river and push the waters up so that the waters are stopped. And as long as the priests stand in the river with the Ark of the Covenant, the waters will be stopped. So the Ark of the Covenant goes before the people. And this is also going to be important because we're going to see the Ark of the Covenant play an important role as it goes before the people into battle as God gives them victory. And of course, the Ark of the Covenant is symbolic of God's presence that goes with them and goes before them. Another strand in chapters 3 and 4 we're going to see is the men representing each tribe. Joshua tells them to select 12 men, one from each tribe, that will gather stones that will be an altar for future generations. The waters of the Jordan are mentioned in several different verses here, and then the actual 12 stones itself that are taken from the bed of the Jordan River. Joshua is going to take these stones and he's going to make 2 altars. One they're going to set up at Gilgal as a reminder of the covenant, as a reminder of what God has done for them. The other, he's going to stack stones in the Jordan River, at the place where the Ark of the Covenant was standing. So chapters 3 and 4 is the crossing over. This is the key moment in Israel's history. It takes the form of a religious ritual led by the priest and the ark. It demonstrates God's hand upon Joshua as well. If you look in chapter 3, Joshua chapter 3, verse 7, look at what Joshua 3:7 says. The Lord said to Joshua, "Today, when they cross the river, I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you." So this river crossing is for God to exalt Joshua as well, to show all the people, I did this with Moses, I'm doing it again with Joshua. Just as I was with Moses, so I'm going to be with Joshua. And then if you look down in verse number 10, it's also a sign. Joshua said to the people, "Here is how you shall know that God is among you." So God says, Joshua, here's how the people are going to know that I'm with you. And Joshua says to the people, here's how you're going to know that God is with you. Here's how you know that the living God is among you, and that you will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Hivites, and list all of the inhabitants of the land. So this river crossing plays a very important role. First of all, an important role because they're actually entering the promised land. They're actually doing it. They're finally here. After all of the wandering in the wilderness, after all of the rebellion, after all of the death, after all of this, they're finally entering the land. So they're receiving the promise little by little. And then it's to show God's miraculous power, obviously, to the nations, just as it was in Egypt, is to show that God is exalting Joshua in the sight of the people, and it's showing the people that God is with them and He will assure them victory. So that's the importance of the river crossing. As we said, the priests bear the Ark of the Covenant on the back of our last page. They step in the waters, and the waters are cut off from flowing. That's in chapter 3, verse 13. As they stand on dry ground, all of Israel passes through the Jordan River into the promised land on dry ground. Again, this parallels the crossing of the Red Sea. In fact, that's explicitly stated in chapter 4. Yahweh your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you, just as Yahweh your God did at the Red Sea. And then we find after the crossing, memorials would be set up. They would take 12 stones out from the riverbed, and they would set it up at Gilgal, and also they would set 12 stones up in the middle of the river to mark where the priests were standing. These stones from out of the midst of the Jordan, to show that God had done this, they set them as a memorial for two reasons. Number one, for future generations to come. And they could see those stones, and they could say, look what God did for our ancestors. And secondly, it was to show God's power to the nations around them. That, hey, Yahweh did this. Your gods didn't. So you better be on the lookout. So chapters 3 and 4, they cross over the Jordan. Then we find in chapter 5, preparing for battle. They go across the Jordan. They go into Gilgal. And they're crossing this Jordan to settle there. Four things happen here in chapter 5 of Joshua. The first thing that happens here is Joshua chapter 5 verse 1 describes how the crossing of the Jordan further demoralizes the kings of Canaan so that they launch no attacks on the Israelites. So chapter 5 verse 1 says, as soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan, for the people of Israel crossed over, their hearts melted. And there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. So after they cross the Jordan, here's how we prepare for battle. We prepare for battle one, because the word is spread, and the king's hearts are melted, and they are afraid. The second thing that happens here in verses 2 through 9 is the male children born during the wilderness wanderings are circumcised. Obviously, circumcision for the male infants was the sign of the covenant that God made with His people. This would be a distinguishing mark, if you will, of God's people and God's covenant to Israel. And obviously, during these wilderness wanderings, this was not practiced like it should have been. So because circumcision symbolizes the promises given to Israel's forefathers, including the promise of the land, this is one thing that they do. Begin to circumcise the males here. The third thing that they do is they hold the Passover. On the 14th day of the first month, the Israelites hold the Passover. The unleavened bread they eat on the next day is made with grain from the land of Canaan. And the manna, the food God provided for them in the wilderness, ceases to fall. So now they're eating from the land of promise. The journey began with the Passover in Egypt, and now the journey in the wilderness ends with the celebration of the Passover as well. The fourth incident that happens here, again, looks forward to the coming battle. So we have the hearts melting in the kings, causing them fear. Then we have spiritual preparation in circumcision and the Passover. Then we have this incident here. So let's look together in Joshua 5, verse 13. Joshua 5:13. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped, and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." That just gives me chill bumps just reading that right there. And Joshua did so. So this is, by most agreement, what we would call a Christophany. Most people agree that this is Christ appearing, the commander of the Lord's army. We know Christ has been with them. He was the rock in the wilderness. First Corinthians tells us that the rock that followed them in the wilderness, that rock was Christ. And so here we have this appearance of this man standing with a sword in his hand, and he identifies himself as the commander of the army of the Lord. And the word that the commander of the army of the Lord gives Joshua is the same word that Moses was given at the burning bush right before he was to go in and deliver his people out. Take your shoes off your feet. And this is a very important, the wording here that links Moses and Joshua even more. And it shows the assurance of victory. That even though Joshua is the human commander and leader, there is one over him that is greater. And thus, we prepare for battle. We've crossed the Jordan. We've spied out the land. We've got a good report. It's really playing on the same themes. In the beginning, it's talking about being strong and courageous. It's talking about following the law. That's what God did. He gave them the law. And then he sends spies out into the land. But instead of failing this time, they succeed in the land. And then instead of rebellion, what are they doing? They're listening to God. They're listening to Joshua. They're doing the rituals of Passover and circumcision. So they're keeping the law instead of breaking the law. And then we find here Joshua again in the face of the commander of the Lord's army, receiving the commands that this is holy ground, and they're going forth into battle. So really, and just in these first 5 chapters, is really the where the previous generation got it wrong, Joshua in this generation is getting it right. And then we'll enter into chapter 6. But I want to finish today with kind of this thought at the end of the chapter to bring us into how Joshua is relating to us. Well, Joshua relates to us because, number one, it shows us that Jesus is our Joshua. Jesus is our Joshua. The connection between Moses and Joshua is important to the nation of Israel because of the promises they were taking. The connection to Joshua and Jesus is important for God's people today. Not in a physical way as it was here with a physical land and physical armies and physical battles, but certainly in a spiritual way. First of all, it's kind of overlooked in our English Bibles, but Jesus' name in Hebrew is the name Joshua. Jesus' name in Hebrew is the name Joshua. It's the Hebrew word Yeshua. Joshua. That's Jesus' name. In Hebrew is Joshua. It's Yeshua, which means Yahweh is salvation. Now you take Yeshua, you bring it over to the Greek, you bring it over to the Latin, and you get the name Jesus. So that's why we say Jesus today instead of Joshua. I do know people, and I do know pastors, that they don't use the name Jesus. That's their prerogative. They call Jesus Yeshua. They call him by his Hebrew name. So it's kind of weird when I'm listening to some of these guys, and they're like, Yeshua did this, Yeshua did that. And I'm like, you got to remind yourself, that's Jesus. But Jesus and Joshua's name is the same in Hebrew. So if you take Joshua's name from the Hebrew, bring it over, his name is Jesus as well. So he is the foreshadowing of, Joshua is the foreshadowing of Jesus. Number two, Jesus also stepped into the Jordan River, just as Joshua and the people stepped into the Jordan River. Jesus stepped in the Jordan River for baptism. But instead of the waters separating and the waters parting like they did with Joshua, when Jesus steps in the Jordan River, the sky separates. And a voice from heaven says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Just as the parting of the Jordan was God's stamp of approval on Joshua, the baptism of Jesus with the parting of the heavens is God's stamp of approval on his Son, Jesus. So Jesus is literally a new Joshua. What did Joshua do? Joshua succeeded Moses. Even though Joshua and the people are under the law, Moses represented the law. And Joshua is the one that succeeded Moses and came after Moses. What comes after the old covenant? The new covenant. Who brings in the new covenant? Jesus. Who's the new Joshua? And the better Joshua? Jesus. So in Jesus, we cross over, just like they crossed from the wilderness into the promised land. In Jesus, we cross from the old covenant to the new covenant. That's what the book of Hebrews is about. The book of Hebrews is written to Hebrews that they are crossing over from the old covenant to the new covenant. Joshua gave his people rest as they entered the promised land. Jesus gives his people spiritual rest as we enter into our promised abundant life in Jesus, forgiven and free and righteous and holy. Just as Joshua led the people of God to victory over the Canaanites, Jesus leads his people to victory by conquering our spiritual enemies of sin and death and Satan and our flesh and the world. Jesus conquers all of our spiritual enemies, rescuing us from the spiritual death of Adam and crosses us over from death to life, giving us victory. Joshua, through the conquest, established what would eventually be the kingdom of Israel in the land, where God's people would fulfill their destiny as being, or could fulfill their destiny as being a light to the nations. Jesus establishes the kingdom of God on the earth, where his church, filled with the Holy Spirit, can fulfill their destiny in being a light to the world and declaring the gospel to the nations. Joshua would divide the land to each tribe for an inheritance. You and I, we have an inheritance. Jesus has given us every spiritual blessing in heavenly places. That's Ephesians 1:3. And this is referred to as our inheritance in Ephesians 1:11. In him we have obtained an inheritance. So what Joshua is doing for the people of Israel here in the Old Testament in fulfilling God's promises, giving them victory, giving them rest, giving them an inheritance, defeating their enemies, succeeding Moses, Jesus does in the new covenant for us in a spiritual way. So looking at Joshua, we always keep our eyes on our Joshua, our Jesus as well.